Hello everyone, we are from Group 9. We'll present our presentation about style, context, and register. Our team consists of me, Laura Ismadewanti, and Angela Risa Rahman. There are 5 subtopics for today's presentation. The first one is accuracy as an influence on style. The second one is accommodation theory. The third one is context, style, and class. The fourth one is style in non-Western societies, and the last one is register.
Let's begin with this example. In each of these three utterances, the speaker is trying to elicit the same information from the addressee, but the context dramatically influences the form of the query. Each request for information is expressed quite differently. Language varies according to its uses as well as its users, according to where it is used and to whom, as well as according to who is using it. The addresses and the context affect our choice of code or variety, whether language, dialect, or style. The difference between the three utterances in this example are stylistic differences. Addressee as an influence on style. The first utterance in this example was addressed by a teenage boy to his friend's mother when she was showing the photos of their skiing holiday to an adult friend. The second utterance was addressed to his friend when he brought round his own photos of the holiday. So, the better you know someone, the more casual and relaxed the speech style you will use to them. People use considerably more standard forms to those they don't know well and more vernacular forms to their friends. In a study in Northern Ireland, for instance, people used more standard English forms with an English stranger visiting their village than they did talking to a fellow villager. Many factors may contribute in determining the degree of social distance or solidarity between people: relative age, gender, social roles, whether people work together or are part of the same family, and so on. These factors may also be relevant to people's relative social status. Let's see how the age of the person addressed and the social background may influence a speaker's style. The first is age of addressee. People generally talk differently to children and to adults, though some adjust their speech style or accommodate more than others. Talking to younger brothers and sisters, even 3-year-olds, have been heard using sing-song intonation and baby talk words like juggy, which they no longer use themselves when talking or writing to a 6-year-old as opposed to a 13-year-old. Most people choose simpler vocabulary and grammatical constructions. In this example, most of the sentences in the letter to the child are short and grammatically simple. Longer ones consist of simple sentences linked by coordination, such as and but. The sentences are also more explicit. Little is left for the child to infer. There are more complex sentences in the letter to the adult with more subordinate clauses, such as he has vowed to write to you in order to express his gratitude. The vocabulary in the two letters is different too. In the first letter, low frequency words such as subsequent, exotic, resorts, vowed, gratitude, embroiled, and absorbing suggest the addressee is not a 6-year-old. In the second letter, simpler and more common words are used, such as like, play, and to, with phrases like a lot and a little while. The different addresses clearly influence the language used, even though the message in each letter is very similar. The second one is social background of addressee. In this example, these utterances illustrate a number of linguistic features which distinguish the pronunciations of newsreaders on different radio stations. In B, there is simplification of consonant clusters, so last becomes last and next becomes next. The pronunciation of the between vowels is voiced, so it sounds like a d. Hence, meeting sounds like meeting. The definite article the is omitted before the titles Prime Minister and Premier, and the honorifics Mrs. and Mr. disappear. And finally, utterance B contracts will not to want. The most convincing evidence comes from the behavior of the same newsreader on different radio stations, where the stations share studios. A person may read the same news on two different stations during the same day. In this situation, newsreaders produce consistently different styles for each audience. The news is the same and the context is identical except for one factor, the dresses. So the same person reading the news on the middle level station reads in a very much less formal style than on the higher brow radio station. Accommodation theory. The examples in the previous section have demonstrated that when people talk to each other, their speech often becomes more similar. In other words, each person's speech converts towards the speech of the person they are talking to. This process is called speech accommodation. It tends to happen when the speakers like one another, or where one speaker has a vested interest in pleasing the other or putting them at ease. Converging towards the speech of another person is usually considered a polite speech strategy. It implies that the addressee's speech is acceptable and worth imitating. Using the same pronunciation and the same sort of vocabulary, for instance, is a way of signaling that you are on the same wavelength. How do speakers accommodate? When people simplify their vocabulary and grammar in talking to foreigners or children, they are converging downwards towards the lesser linguistic proficiency of their addressees. When in an interview with the hospital matron, a nurse adopts some of the matron's pronunciation features, she is converging upwards in her speech. In multilingual countries such as Singapore and India, with many varieties to choose from, people may accommodate to others by selecting the code or variety that is most comfortable for their addresses. Conversely, in a bilingual city like Montreal, French Canadians in cafes and stores may use English to customers that they identify as English speakers in order to improve their chance of a good sale. Speech divergence. Deliberately choosing a language not used by one's addressee is the clearest example of speech divergence. When the Arab nations issued an oil communique to the world not in English but in Arabic, they were making a clear political statement. They no longer wished to be seen as accommodating to the Western English-speaking powers. Accent divergence also occurs. In New Zealand, working class men often respond to the university-educated students who join them just for the summer on the docks, in factories, or in the shearing sheds by increasing their swearing and using a higher frequency of vernacular forms. Speech divergence does not always indicate a speaker's negative attitudes towards the addressees. Where the divergent forms are admired, divergence can be used to benefit the diverger. A small difference, such as a slight foreign accent, can be appealing. Brigitte Bardot and Maurice Chevalier exploited their French accents in speaking English to add to their appeal. The Spanish accented English of actress Penelope Cruz and tennis champion Rafael Nadal greatly enhanced their public appeal. A foreigner can also elicit help by using an accent or vocabulary which signals inadequate control of the language. Speakers may also deliberately diverge both from their own usual speech style and that of their addressees towards the style of a third party for special effect. This has been labeled referee design. The third party is referred to although they are not present. When you imitate your teacher to amuse your friends, or when you adopt a prestigious accent to impress your boss, you are engaging in referee design. Like metaphorical code switching, with which it has much in common, referee design allows the speaker to exploit the symbolic function of language and allude in an economical way to more than one set of values. Stylization: when someone goes beyond their usual or normal ways of speaking and behaving and engages in a high or strong performance of some sort, the term stylization is useful. The most obvious examples of stylization are found in the speech of comedians and singers who perform to entertain or amuse us. We can all make use of linguistic resources in this way. When your friend adopts a pseudo accent to make you laugh or to be sarcastic, they are indulging in stylization. Stylization can draw on any aspect of language. A stylized performance may involve feature of a particular regional accent, or stigmatized vernacular grammatical features, or very formal grammar, or very erudite vocabulary, or high pitch of or a distinctive intonation pattern. Parody and pantomime typically involve stylization. Over-convergent behavior may be perceived as patronizing and ingratiating, as sycophantic, or even as evidence that the speaker is making fun of others. Listeners also react differently to different types of convergence. A Canadian speaker was more favorably rated when he accommodated in speech rate and content than when he adopted a mild RP accent as well. Accent accommodation was seen as going too far. People seemed to feel that by altering his accent, the speaker was misleading his listeners about his true identity. In general, reactions to speech convergence and divergence depend on the reasons people attribute for the convergence or divergence. If divergence is perceived as unavoidable, for instance, then the reaction will be more tolerant than when it is considered deliberate. Deliberate divergence will be heard as uncooperative or antagonistic. Someone who uses English in Montreal because their French is clearly inadequate will be perceived more sympathetically than someone who deliberately chooses to use English to francophone.
Next, we have context, style, and class. Formal context and social class. Although the degree of formality determines the choice of style, characteristics of the addressee are not the only relevant factors. The context and the roles of participants in the formal setting is relevant. For example, the way the businesswoman was addressed was largely influenced by the relationship between the woman and her addressee in terms of relative status and solidarity. People who were very close to her used a short form of her first name, for example, Meg. People who were less close and socially subordinate used her title and last name, for example, Mrs. Walker. A law court is a formal setting where the social roles and of participants override their personal relationship in determining the appropriate linguistic forms. For example, in classrooms where a child's mother or father is the teacher, Children called their parents Mrs. Grady or Mr. David rather than Mom or Dad. Different styles within an interview. In a social dialect survey in New York, William Leboff demonstrated some ingenuity in devising ways of overriding this stranger effect to elicit a wider range of styles within the interview context. He asked his interviewees to read aloud a passage of continuous speech and a set of word lists, one of which included words such as pin and pen, which called minimal pairs, which differed only on one pronunciation feature. Leboff's methodological challenge called Observer's Paradox. The aim of linguistic research is to find out how people talk when they are not being systematically observed, but the data are only available through systematic observation. Leboff also utilized the tendency of people using less formal style when they are emotionally involved. For example, for asking people to report on a serious accident. Colloquial style or the vernacular. Techniques to elicit vernacular style. First, topic manipulation. Second, recorded small groups of people rather than individuals and chosen a very comfortable or informal setting. These are strategies which encourage people to shift towards a more vernacular style. One social dialectologist collected her data from adolescents in adventure playgrounds, and she recorded them in groups of 2 or 3. Examples of colloquial style. Pronunciation features. H dropping, for example, oh well, you said, and in. We was up there cutting. Grammatical features. Was with plural subject we. For example, we was up there cutting. And come fish came. Father, come on to us. The interaction of social class and style. The way people from different social groups speak with information about the way people speak in different contexts. It is clear that features of social class and contextual style interact. Take a look at the diagram. The figure illustrates the relationship between social class, style, and linguistic variation. The structured hierarchy of the Norwich social classes is indicated by each of the distinct lines drawn on the diagram. Group 4 at the top of the graph is the lowest social group and uses the highest proportion of vernacular in pronunciation. Going down to the graph, each social group uses fewer vernacular in pronunciations than the one above and more than the one below. So the lines are clearly distinguishable. The diagram also shows that the more formal the style, the fewer vernacular in pronunciations occur. Interspeaker variation. The same linguistic feature often distinguishes between speakers socially. And there are intra-speaker variation, while within the speech of one person it distinguishes with different styles. Hypercorrection. It is the exaggeration of some lower class speakers in imitating middle class standard speech. For example, the diagram provides another example of the pattern relationships between social group and linguistic variation discussed in the previous slide. The structured hierarchy of New York social classes is indicated by each of the distinct lines drawn on the diagram. In fact, Leboff comments that R is such a sensitive sociolinguistic variable that he could have drawn as many lines as he could distinguish social groups. Because it is a prestige variable which is spreading through the community, it stratifies the New York community very accurately and finely. The diagram also illustrates variation in speech style. For example, the use of I rather than me in constructions such as between you and I.
Style in non-Western societies. Japanese is an example which illustrates the complexity of stylistic variation which can be found in languages. For example, there are three words for house, oma, griyo, and dalam, and five forms for the word you. Once you have selected the appropriate stylistic level, you must follow the rules for which forms may occur with which. The sentences in this example are ordered from the most formal high style level 3A known as Kromo Inggil to the least formal low style level 1 known as Ngoko. Although there is a great deal of overlap, every sentence is different from each other and not a single word form is common to all of them. Selecting the appropriate level of Japanese for a particular interaction involves taking account of your relationship to the addressee in context. As elsewhere, solidarity or degree of friendship and relative status assessed by such factors as age, wealth, descent, education, and occupation are important in assessing the relationship. The result may be that each of the participants selects a different level of Japanese. If I am an ordinary educated citizen speaking to a high government official, I will use the highest level, 3A, to express respect, but the official will use only level 1, or known as Ngoko, to me. To very high status Japanese, on the other hand, will both use level 3 to each other.
The last subtopic is register. It is an occupational style using specialized or technical jargon. It describes the language of groups of people with common interests or jobs, or the language used in situations associated with such groups, such as the language of doctors, engineers, journals, legalists, etc. Sport announcer talk. When people describe a sporting event, the language they use is quite clearly distinguishable from language used in other contexts. Terms like silly on, square leg, the covers and gully, for instance, to describe positions and off break. Googly and leg break to describe deliveries are examples of vocabulary peculiar to cricket. Play-by-play description focuses on the action. This involves features such as syntactic reduction and the inversion of normal word order in sentences. In color commentary, by contrast, where there is more time, nouns tend to be heavily modified. Syntactic reduction. Sports announcers often omit the subject, noun, or pronoun as in A, and frequently omit the verb be as well as utterances B and C illustrate. Utterances D and E omit only B. Syntactic inversion. Reversal or inversion of the normal word order is another feature of sports announcer talk. This device allows the announcer to foreground or focus on the action and provides time to identify the subject of the action, an important piece of information for listeners. You can take a look at the examples below. Heavy noun modification. When this is the case, the subject nouns which are the focus of interest are often heavily modified both after the noun as in A and before the noun as in B and C. You can take a look at the examples below. Routines and formulas. An interesting feature of sports commentaries, including race calling, the commentary accompanying a horse race, is the use of routines to reduce the memory burden on the speaker. Livestock auctions in New Zealand, tobacco auctions in the USA, and North American ice hockey commentaries. These registers are all characterized by the extensive use of oral formulas. The formulas involve a small number of fixed syntactic patterns and a narrow range of lexical items. That's all from us. Thank you and have a nice day, everyone.